Welcome to the Unbecoming Hub podcast. Reflections about being human without treating yourself as something to fix. I'm your host, Lacey Kelly. So there's an epidemic going on that I feel like doesn't get enough attention. And it's the epidemic of the parent-child relationship. And I'm talking about all parent-child, adult child, little child. It's all happening. There's so much strain in parent-child relationships right now. I want to talk about it today. And this is coming up because I had a couple of you ask me a couple questions from something I said in last week's podcast about adaptation, where I made a mention about how childhood, it's inevitable to adapt to the conditions of our childhood. And it doesn't mean something went wrong. And the implications of thinking it went wrong and how that shows up in parent-child relationships. And so I had a couple questions in the spirit of, if I had just had more attunement as a child, wouldn't I be fine? Like, isn't that true? If something went wrong? So we're going to talk about that today. And this is a big topic, so I'm going to do my best to think in a straight line. It's another one of those. I have my outline, but I can get off on things sometimes. So I'm going to do my best to just talk in a straight line. Okay, so just to kind of recap last week a little bit, as humans, we're born to adapt to our conditions that we're put in. It's one of our best features, I think, how adaptable we are. And way back in the day, we were born into conditions that required adaptation on the level of our physiological survival. So we were battling terrain and weather and predators, tribal dynamics. And then fast forward to our modern time, and we are surviving the single family home. So for most of us in the first world, our basic needs are met to some degree. I know that's not true for everybody. But for a lot of us, those are pretty taken care of in one way or another. So our nervous system registers the emotional weather of the house as the threat, whether or not we're belonging to the tribe. So the primary threat is being exiled, rejected, abandoned, left behind, that kind of thing. And our identity forms, our personality forms alongside these adaptations. So we're developing into a person as we're adapting to the environment that we're in. And those adaptations later become what we call identity or patterns or personality. And they're not always that way. They are learned adaptations that fit a certain set of conditions at any given time or at that time. And that's why they can cause struggles later in our adult life, our adult relationship, because we're still operating in those adaptations, even though the conditions have changed. And it's possible to change those adaptations and patterns, but we'll talk about change in a different podcast. I won't go off on that right now. So anyway, just to kind of sum last week. So now we get into the dynamics of the parent-child relationship in the frame of adaptation. And we have to understand the current frame we're operating from to make the change to a different frame. So let's say you're someone coming to therapy because you have a pattern in your relationships that you want to work through. You see it as limiting you. You don't want to do it anymore. Something you don't like about yourself. And you go to therapy or you dive into the self-help world and you start to trace it back, right? It's usually what we do. We kind of trace it back, at least in relational and attachment therapy, which is exclusively my training, is all about relational and attachment dynamics. So we trace it back. Okay, what's the origin of this pattern? How did your system learn to organize around connection? What kept connection close and what pushed connection away? Because that is usually where identity starts to form. So we understand that. We start to look at it more so, at least in my practice, in my view, as a cause and effect, a natural consequence. Unintended consequence, but a natural consequence, a cause and effect, kind of stripped of the good bad paradigm. But I didn't always operate that way as a clinician. In the training of developmental trauma, complex trauma, relational dynamics, attachment theory, there tends to be a subtle implication that if you had just had more attunement, you would have had secure attachment and none of these things would be problems. And so I kind of framed things in that way, not so explicitly, but that's like where my mind would go as a therapist. And after a while, I kind of had to pause and think, is this actually helping to frame it this way? Because I was working with adult children, and then they would start to have some strain in their parent-child relationships. And I'm working with parents who are working through these things from their childhood, feeling terrified they were going to do something similar to their children. And so I started to think, okay, and mostly in working with my parents, what does prevention look like? How can I help this parent alleviate some of this pressure to get it right? Because on one hand, we're saying in attachment world, if you had just had more attunement, you would be secure and therefore better. But on the other hand, as a parent with a small child, we're saying you can't get it right. I mean, things are going to happen. You just have to do your best, right? Like you have to repair the ruptures. You have to prioritize connection over performance and behavior. There's like things we can do and say as parental interventions. But does misattunement still happen? Yes, it does. And so on the other side, there's like this permission for parents to put it down, but then we're not giving that permission to the parents that raised us. So I had to slow down and think, okay, hold on. What are we actually doing in attachment theory right now? Because we have a whole world of parenting advice all about the emotional dynamics that didn't exist when our parents were parenting. Parenting advice was behavioral because that was the field at the time. It was all about behavior modification. And as the field has shifted towards emotional intervention and attachment, now there's this whole world of attachment advice in parenting, of how to make sure your child feels emotionally seen. And it's causing a lot of problems because now we're holding our parents that raised us to the standard of the advice present day, which they didn't have. And we're also feeling a lot of pressure to do it right with our children. And you can see the outcome of some of this in gentle parenting that we've actually found has caused a generation of extreme anxiety. Turns out focusing everything on feelings may not be the way to go either. Pendulum swung a little far the other way. So what does it actually look like? Like what are we doing in attachment world? What's the message we're sending right now? And I had to slow down as a clinician and step back and think, how do I want to approach this outside of the noise of attachment world and theories and things I've been taught? Like, how do I want to approach this? And this is really in large part where the process of unbecoming has come from. Because I thought that we have to find a way to talk about attachment and relational dynamics and all these things outside of the realm of good, bad childhood or misattunement, attunement childhood. Because there's a very real factor in this that we are human beings living in the human condition, which is inherently imperfect and will never be perfect. You can't have attunement without misattunement. You can't have happy without sad. You can't have grief without love. So, this is how I came to the place of cause and effect, unintended consequences. Because in order for an adult child to process and understand their relational template, which is what I call the patterns we see within ourselves that organize around connection, the push-pull within ourselves and with others we can get into, that relational template did develop in childhood alongside our identity and personality development that taught us about connection. And because the primary threat we experienced in childhood was relational, we are largely organized around that. So we have to understand the relational template. We have to be able to talk about childhood, but how do we do it without pathologizing it? Now, disclaimer, caveat, there are objectively really bad childhoods. There's objectively traumatic incidents that happened, short-term and long-term. Like that is a reality for some people. I've worked with a lot of them, in which case it's really important to validate that aspect of it. But something I've noticed that I think has caused a bit of an unintended consequence in working with people in attachment is the idea of misattunement, unavoidable misattunement, being categorized as emotional abuse or something similar. Misattunement is a non-negotiable reality of being a human. You are going to misattune to your child, your parents misattuned to you. We can work to mitigate that to the best that we can, but it's going to happen, and that's not a failure. But we've been talking about this in such a way that makes it feel like it's a failure, and we're certainly going to mess up our kids for it. Like as if our kids have anything other than the most secure attachment in the world, we have failed. And, it's causing a lot of strain and pressure. There's another factor in it all as well, that our single family home is a new phenomenon. If you think about a child being born outside of our modern day history, our modern times, they kind of came along for the ride with the parent. They were a part of the day. And now we have, very structured jobs in a way we didn't before, where both parents are working out of the home. Maybe a child is in daycare out of necessity. Structure of the day is entirely different. And these things aren't avoidable. They're requirements of our modern time for a lot of people. That doesn't mean you're failing as a parent. It's just the reality of our time. So is misattunement going to happen in that paradigm? Absolutely. Is that wrong? No. Is there anything you can do about it? Not really. You give your child the attention you can when you're around them and they're home and you're together. And they're all right. Because another thing that got me thinking about this was the thought of like, are we really that fragile as humans, as babies, as toddlers, as children? That we can't withstand misattunement? I mean, we're the same species that has survived Ice Age. We're the same species that has built this entire modern world. And we're breaking down at misattunement? I don't know. Something doesn't land for me about that. So Attunement is the ability to see and read and anticipate your child's needs and be responsive. It's just being responsive. Misattunement is when we're not responsive. We don't read the room. A misattunement is a fact. Ask any parent who's had two children who are opposites. It's like one child, I can read that one. I know that one I get. This one I don't get. I try everything and nothing seems to work. Okay, well, that is misattunement. In your attempt to attune, there's misattunement. Is that wrong? No. You're attempting to attune, you're attempting to understand. And there's something, because you can't read their mind. As much as we want to believe we can read our child's mind, you can't. They are their own person. And so this is where we get into the concept, the fantasy of the highly attuned caregiver. Because we hold this fantasy as the child and we hold this fantasy as the parent. And we also hold this fantasy as a partner. I'll get into that next. But the way we've talked about childhood dynamics has kind of caused this subtle implication of thinking that it was possible to have a perfectly attuned caregiver. And it's just not true. You as a human are going to adapt to the conditions that you're in every single time. So even if you had a more attuned caregiver, you would have just adapted in a different way. You would just have different patterns. You wouldn't have no patterns. You might feel a little more secure than you do, but you're still going to feel insecure at times because that's also being human. And we tend to forget our inherent worthiness and wholeness as people, regardless of what happened in our childhood. It's kind of like a no-win. So I don't mean to be pessimistic about it, but it's kind of true. By nature of us externally orienting to adapt to our environment, we orient to the external, we focus on others, and then internalize others' behavior about ourselves, we adapt to it. In order for that to go well, we kind of have to separate from that inherent wholeness. We kind of have to start to break apart a little bit and show the parts of ourselves that bring connection, hide the parts of ourselves that don't. And we start to feel incomplete, which can cause some of that insecure attachment. And if it doesn't happen at home, it can happen in the relationships outside of the home as well. Not to mention that circumstances of single family homes are just an entirely new phenomenon that I don't think we have enough data on yet, especially when there's two parents working in the home. So coming back to the attunement piece, the fantasy of the attuned caregiver. So we go to therapy to work on our patterns, and we're left feeling like something in our childhood went wrong. And I remember in my own therapy, I was going to therapy because I was complaining about how my husband wasn't perfectly attuned to me and couldn't just read me like a book, and craving that ability to just feel seen, you know. And my therapist said something to me, which I loved this therapist. She was amazing. But this thing she said to me kind of shook me up, and it got me thinking a lot about this. Because she said, Lacey, you can't relive childhood. And it really struck me because the implication of it was I am craving this from my husband because I didn't get it growing up. And I'm wanting from him what I did not receive in childhood. And I can't relive that. I can't expect my husband to respond to me the way a parent would have. That's the implication. And I think a lot of us get that implication when we go work in attachment. And I thought, now my mom and I are really close. I think we are. She thinks I'm spicy sometimes, but I think that's just mother daughter relationships. And I know without a doubt, I am loved by my mother more than anything. And I always have been. Like, there's no question in my mind. So something didn't really fit with me about this implication that if she had been more attuning, I wouldn't be wanting this from my husband. And so I sat with it and I sat with it. And I'm a very introspective person. And there was a while there that I believed that, but it just didn't fit because talking to my mom, being with my mom, like, I don't feel like she should have given me more or could have. And were there unintended consequences of her parenting? Yeah. Was there cause and effect? Yeah, there was. But does that mean she gets to become the scapegoat for this feeling I have? Just didn't sit right with me. And I think there's a lot of that because most of the time, when you work with someone who's had a childhood like mine, like it had its moments, wasn't always easy. I might have some kind of ACE score, but it wasn't what I would consider to be traumatic. And if you're someone in attachment world and you're listening to this, it's like, oh, she's in denial. She's protecting her mom's feelings, all these different things you could use to say that I somehow haven't done enough work to realize the truth. And that's another insidious part of it all. Like there's a rebuttal for everything until you just kind of submit to the truth or submit to the idea that your childhood was bad, that you were lacking something, and that explains your adult relationships. Now, the implication that I see on parent child relationships, the adult parent child relationships, is severe because now the child is taking this to the adult, to the parent. And the parent either goes into guilt or defends themselves. So they're either invalidating the child or going into their own shame, which also invalidates the child in a way, which then confirms to the child that they're not attuning and they don't understand and all these things. And it just drives a wedge in between. It just drives a wedge into the relationship. And there's no permission to let the human condition play out in a parent child relationship these days. No permission on either side. And I think it's kind of slowly and subtly just breaking down families. I work with a lot of estrangement, parents that come to me whose adult child has cut them out because they're not doing the work, not going to therapy, not working on themselves. And I think there's merit to that. I think it's important to have some level of awareness of how you contribute to relational dynamics. But the intensity around it, there's like a persecution around it all that is really challenging. And then the parent with a small child is holding themselves to that standard and highly critical of their parenting. So I just don't think it's working. I think we need to find a different way to talk about these things with each other. I think the adult child who has realized their relational template and the cause and effect from their early dynamics and how it's playing out in their adult relationships is very important. I think that's important work to do. Is it necessary to take it back to the parent? Not always. So then how do you have a relationship with the parent once you see these things? If you're seeing it through the lens of the human condition playing out as it always would have, there's a lot more grace, a lot more forgiveness, a lot more compassion, while also holding the complexity of your emotions and the experience you are having as a result of those early dynamics. They don't have to cancel each other out. The capacity is there to experience both. If you're a parent parenting a young child, you can hold the complexity of, I'm going to prioritize the connection. I'm going to do my best in paying attention to my child. And I'm going to repair the ruptures and forgive myself when I am inevitably human and inevitably going to get it wrong. We have the capacity to do that. But in our culture today, it feels so cold, doesn't it? I don't think it has to be that way. So the fantasy of the attuned caregiver that we then project onto our partners, I don't think it was ever it's not a realistic expectation for anybody. And just to take it one layer deeper, maybe, just maybe, that longing we have to feel seen and understood on such a deep soul level is not something a human can provide at all. Maybe that's happening as a result of a culture who has also lost connection to something bigger than themselves. Maybe that's happening because we don't organize around something bigger than humanity anymore. And so we're putting humans in the place of God. And humans are never going to be God. I talk more about that in my book, God is a Dirty Word, if you want to check that out. But that's a whole other level of deep. And we're about up on time for this podcast. So I can't go there. I'm rambling at you for another 30 minutes. So, anyway, the next time you find yourself contemplating your childhood dynamics, how they're playing out in your adult relationship, just pause, slow down, and see if you can remember you're human, the environment you were in. I'm going to even venture to say, even the bad ones. You were adapting to a set of circumstances. There was cause and effect from the parenting. And some of that, parents need to be held accountable. And some of it is just life playing out. And we can see the cause and effect and feel the effect and understand the cause without it turning into a judgment, a courtroom, or parents on trial. So I think that's it for today. And I'll see you next time. You can find more of this work at theunbecominghub.com. Until next time.